Anita Say Chan is a scholar. She's an educator. She focuses on feminist and decolonial approaches to technologies. If you know me and the show and my writing, you know we're already in alignment here. She's an associate professor of information sciences and media, and she is founder of the Community Data Clinic, both at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her new book, the one we're about to talk about, is called Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. It came out this month, and as I say, I've been reading it with great interest. So first of all, Anita Say Chan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now there are all sorts of places we could start with this, but let's start with the declaration in your title and what it assumes. The title is Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. I think a lot of people, a few people I should say, have drawn a connection between the eugenics movement of the last century and the century before, if not earlier, and big tech in the 21st century. So where do you see those two? Where do you see one informing the other?
Yeah, we often forget that eugenics, when we can think about our contemporary age as one that is this sort of unprecedented kind of move for datification, and that is the sort of fundamental move that powers our big data systems, that powers our internet economy, our platform economy, and of course, now evolving into this AI-driven economy. But we often forget that the first massive global datification movement was not something that started, a decade ago with big sort of massive moves for datification. And again, it's trying to shift towards a big data and AI-driven economy, but happened over a century ago with the global eugenics movement. That was really the kind of, again, first global movement for datification of human populations. And it was driven by a radical eliticism, not unlike what we're seeing today coming out of Silicon Valley, and a kind of existential paranoia of that elite of over a century ago, that because of heightened globalization, new demographics in terms of urbanization, and a mixing of classes that we'd never seen before happening in Western societies, there was this growing paranoia, especially amongst a kind of patrician elite, that their population, their genetic gene pool would start to dilute. And so this was a kind of move for datification, really, again, driven by an existential paranoia and a kind of protectionism, an attempt to kind of protect this kind of supposedly fitter gene pool, and to eventually, as we started to see, of course, not just with Nazi Germany, but a host of different kinds of legislative gains and moves that happened right here in the US by the turn of the century, by the turn of the 20th century, to also try and perfect national populations in the image of a eugenic society. And data was fundamental to all of this.
And eugenics or racial breeding or whatever we want to call it, the idea that you can measure people's essentially, I would say, the value as a human being, and in your and its relationship to racism and other forms of bigotry. People forget, I think, that some of the same people back then who were tech visionaries of one sort or another also fell prey to it. I think H.G. Wells was adjacent to this stuff, right?
Absolutely.
And I remember, for example, reading his book World Brain, which some people say is a precursor, predicted the internet, except on microfiche with like lanterns or whatever projecting it, except that his difference was that the elites would decide what the information would be that was made available to everyone else. And
that's right.
Right. So there's a kind of genetic eugenics, there's a cultural eugenics, there's a social eugenics, educational. I mean, to me, that's why I think your book is important, because it bleeds into everything with me, and obviously I want to get your thoughts on it, but with me, it says, they used to say in business, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And but when you try to measure really the human worth of people, it means you want to manage it, which is a totalitarian vision. And I kept thinking of that all the way through your book. But what are your thoughts on that?
That's right. I mean, it starts with metrification. And one of the kinds of fundamental tenets of eugenesis from the get-go was that this kind of liberal notion, classical liberal notion, that is, that human life is equal, that all men should be thought of as having equal potential and equal beings, with the sort of right to determine their own futures, right? This is sort of a tenet that classical liberalism is built upon, and that very notion of human rights and human liberalism is, again, all built around. Eugenicists were fundamentally opposed to all of that. Their idea was very much that human societies and human individuals were fundamentally unequal, not just different, but unequal, that there was better and not better, and that human fitness could be measured hierarchically, that social hierarchy was naturally built into the kind of ecology of mankind, and that we should just admit this and embrace this. This is why eugenicists from the get-go were also convinced that democratic policies, welfare state, democratic institutions, the democratic state in and of itself was the most anathema, the most hateful thing that could possibly have been invented, because it was essentially built around exactly that idea of human equity, of human equality, and a notion that we should then therefore structure things in a way that would enable and protect certain classes, with this notion that everyone had a notion of an equal right to some version of equal liberty, and again, a sort of equation of rights. From eugenicist point of view, the notion of equal rights was ridiculous. It essentially was a suck and a drain on the rest of society. From their point of view, some lives, as American eugenicists famously coined, some lives were born to be a burden on others. And therefore, what were we doing as national states, enabling and protecting these sort of unfit, undeserving classes with things like public education and the welfare state that essentially just enabled the future degradation of society. So the earliest eugenicist from the get-go, Sir Francis Galton, is of course the framed originator of the term eugenics, and really started writing and working around his thesis around what eugenics was in the 1860s, and of course by the 1880s had really formalized this around the language of eugenics. But from the get-go was really obsessed with counting and quantification, and from the get-go was very much certain that he could prove, and fellow eugenicists, fell in line as well, that they could prove essentially this fundamental inequality of human life through data, and that with enough numbers, they would be able to convince everyone else around them, starting with fellow patrician elites, then lobbying other powerful politicians to be able to start to enact their policies. And of course, that the numbers would just speak for themselves, and so that they would be able to lobby wider publics as well around really what should be a kind of reprogramming, a social reengineering of society around eugenic ideals. And of course, we could see in the end really what that brought about in Nazi Germany, but we don't even need that experiment to see what some of the sort of most really quite startling legislative gains had been. We can use looking at just the historical record of the U.S. itself. We often forget we had
And if
gotten that far.
if one compares the historical record with what's happening now, the parallel, which you do in your book, the parallels are striking. I mean, people now can mock, I think, who was it, Cesare Lombroso, who say, your skull shape determined, but it's the same impulse, it seems to me. And so I was struck, for example, just in your bio about, the idea of decolonial approaches to technology. I remember like 15 years ago, I wrote something about the idea of quantitative imperialism, the idea that number crunching should take over every aspect of human activity. But number crunching is not a neutral thing. You decide what you're going to crunch, how you're going to define it. Every one of those things becomes digitized folklore, bias, whatever you want to call it. So,
Right. That's
and
right. Yeah.
that's what we're seeing now, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, again, this sort of drive for the quantification of all human activity and human life, a kind of measurement. Um, Silicon Valley doesn't oftentimes say that they're doing this to sort of set up any kind of hierarchy. From their point of view, they're sort of just datifying activity with the idea that this will end up serving, the most innocent versions of it, or that it will just allow capitalism to serve you better, right? To sort of get to know you better. And so you should want to be quantified. Eugenicists said very, very similar things. And Galton had set up a whole kind of anthropometric lab to start to do all kinds of sort of human measurements, from the kind of strength of blow to acuity of vision, would go out to fairs and again, sort of like amass all of this data on thousands and thousands of visitors, again, under this sort of like hunger to datify human beings. And today Silicon Valleyites don't tell you that this is about, deciding who gets better services and who doesn't. But of course, we can already see in terms of the kinds of ecologies that they built out that they've already made assessments for which populations are more deserving of certain protections and not. All across there is not equivalent versions of Facebook architectures all across the world. There are some populations that were once upon a time thought and are still thought of as having and being more deserving of more safety and security protocols that other nations don't get. The Western nations and the U.S. Had for the longest time, and we will see what will happen once those disappear. But for the last several years, we were the ones where the majority of safety protocols for large tech companies have been invested. And so when you go and you saw a range of different human rights abuses get reported, from India to Myanmar to Ethiopia, and tech platforms as being really at the center of that narrative of how political violence, of how extreme and authoritarian nationalisms, of how essentially not just anti-liberal, but anti-democratic, deeply authoritarian states and political powers were fermenting and were using social media as their political tool to shore up powers. None of this was unpredicted. All of this was being reported by various actors and civil rights organizations, civil society organizations on the ground. We're reporting this back to large tech companies. Large tech company workers, as we saw with things like the Frances Haugen Facebook papers release, already knew this, were self-reporting this as well. And still, at the end of the day, they decided that some populations were deserving of better protections than others. And literally, we could see thousands and thousands of lives, bodies floating down rivers. I mean, literally, this is what was being reported as being connected back to the kinds of extremism that was proliferating across social media platforms, just in plain light, without really any kind of checks, and with with even human rights workers having a difficulty with being taken seriously, even by the tech companies who said that they would try and hold themselves accountable to them. There was nothing of the sort, and nothing really changed. And so again, you can very much see how it is that some lives had been calculated as being more worthy than others. And now, moving forward, we can also see how much this is even a kind of logic that we see playing out in the US, with various minoritized populations in the US also seeing this sort of extremism of language and having broad difficulties, even in the face of having various organizations really documenting this, the rise of hate speech, the rise of political violence, again, even in the US. And we can see what's happened with Zuckerberg's latest call of just saying that he believes his bottom line is more important to protect than a range of vulnerable populations and just sort of democratic ideals, even here, even close to home.
And one wonder, it raises a question, how much of this is by design? How much of this is an accidental byproduct of the business model? How much is cynical, hacking, to use that horrid word, social hacking to, maximize profits? And
Right.
how much is really a deep ideology? And, by way of background, I have information that suggests that the economist Tyler Cowen, who I've written about a few
Right.
times, I don't know, who he is very popular in the Silicon Valley. And his thesis, he wrote a book called Average is Over.
Right.
And his thesis is that to survive in the new economy, and he says, it's not that I want this, but this is the reality. To survive,
Yeah.
85% of the population is essentially surplus. 14.5% is above average, so
Right.
they can serve the machinery. He doesn't put it that way, but and then 0.5% or so, and I may be wrong about the 0.5, but it's a rough right there, is the people who own everything.
Right.
And and I also have it on good information. I have one or two friends who are not billionaires, but work for them and have been to their
Right.
houses for dinner and so on, that this is absolutely the belief. And you
Yeah.
see, Doug Rushkoff and others writing about, the
Yeah.
doomsday planning and all that. So I guess that raises the question, uh, is this a society they're deliberately building? Is this, in other words, are they trying to winnow out the 80% from the 15%, from the 5%? I know I moved my numbers a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, or is this just what the hell, we'll addict them to the software and we'll get more clicks and we'll make more money? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I would say that much like eugenics in its early days, there's a spectrum. I mean, eugenics, this is why I write about eugenics as a movement, not just a pseudoscience, but it was really a movement. And it encompassed everyone, as you were saying, back in its day, from sort of like H.G. Wells, famous cultural figures, to sort of some famous progressives. Some people, thought of as even W. Du Bois have written about them as as a eugenicist, in part because of the kind of his framing of the sort of Black intelligentsia and intellectual elite. And really, eugenics was a kind of broad spectrum and a movement, much like you might say, kind of moves for data science and datification today as a kind of broad spectrum. There's a sort of softer versions of it and the sort of harder line versions of it. In the book, I really focus more on the sort of harder line versions of it because those were the sort of leaders of the eugenics movements. And so there's a kind of, again, a wide spectrum of folks who might have believed in some version of like light social engineering can get us to the point of a eugenic utopia, and this can take decades to build for the kind of ideal human breeding that we might see. But there were, of course, a range of other sort of leading figures who would fight for the kinds of infrastructural changes and policy and legislative gains from immigration, the initial immigration bans that we saw happening in the U.S. in the 1870s, to, of course, the kinds of immigration quotas, literacy tests, new legalization to allow us to deport essentially anyone who was thought of as a political radical that was associated with essentially moral and mental unfitness. Those things were supposedly correlated according to eugenic forms of data collection, quite questionable data collection, but nonetheless, all of this was being sort of erected through their arguments of this being empirical science, and also in 30. And again, I'm using the U.S. as sort of the prime example, and that's really where I delve into in the book because it's so forgotten as a kind of foundation for where so many of these experiments happen. But in 30 different states, 30 plus different states in the U.S., we legalized the forced sterilization of unfit populations, including in states like California in 1909 and Indiana. I mean, it was all across the U.S. And so I start out by really sort of leaning more into who were the leaders of this movement that managed to get and architect this whole array of different sorts of legislative gains that were deeply, deeply anti-immigrant, racist at their foundation, but we also forget how they were also ableist. They disproportionately punish the unfit, the mentally unfit, and
Right.
supposedly people with low IQs. Again, this was all a mishmash of things that were being falsely correlated, but that eugenicists again argued was backed up by their science, but they correlated immigrants and immigrants from Jewish immigrants from the global South, obviously immigrants from Southern Europe as well. Northern Europeans were to be privileged because supposedly they had higher IQs and had lower proclivities for pauperism, lower proclivities for the drink, for prostitution, a whole of criminal activity. So all of these things, again, were sort of moved into place through this sort of a kind of stalwart advocates who, as you said, were included not just cultural figures, but really a kind of the who's who and the elite of knowledge institutions back in their day. Deans and heads of universities, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the dean of Harvard Medical School, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., eventually a Supreme Court judge, all famous eugenicists. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was the person who had said famously, 3 generations of idiots is enough to essentially maintain the legal status of forced sterilization of the unfit in American states and US states. David Starr Jordan, the founder, the first president of the founding president of Stanford University, Paul Popenoe, Louis Terman, I mean, you name it, like the founder of Ladies Home Journal, a whole range of different sorts of cultural figures and actors. It was very much a vanguard in its day, not unlike the way datification, data science, the kinds of leads of a movement towards datification of human populations and a movement towards an AI-based economy are very much thought of as and seen as part of a vanguard now. It is not yet the default way that we organize society, but the intention, the dream, the kind of hope, particularly of the most stalwarts of these activists and advocates, is that if we can gain enough sort of traction in various segments of society, starting with, of course, with large-scale policy and a fight to get control of essentially branches of government, of democratic governments, to essentially turn government inside out, to undo and de-architect democratic states, to enable essentially a remaking of them under the guise of eugenic utopia. And then sort of working their way down through other sorts of things, communication streams, the internet, and the idea you asked whether or not, what's the sort of kind of grand scheme of this. We oftentimes dismiss many of these big tech moguls as really just doing this out of kind of greedy capitalism. That's clearly part of it.
Right.
But when you look at business decisions like Twitter and Elon Musk's sort of like clinging and obsession with taking control of that, not for profit. Twitter has been a kind of X, however you want to call that platform now, is still a questionable business enterprise, but it has been very, very profitable as a kind of political machine to be able to obviously deliver things like even arguably the US election. And through that, then architect a whole other range of different sorts of channels that in the end do deliver a kind of let's say, increase of bottom line. I mean, we've seen all kinds of things economically now benefit since the November elections happened, Elon Musk and his sort of range.
Sure. Well, and the election, your publishers must have been thrilled with the results of the election because it makes your book Predatory Data that much. I'm being ironic, of course, but it certainly highlights the issue that you're covering. But I'm glad you mentioned some of those figures like Oliver Wendell Holmes, because it raises another interesting philosophical question, which is, the relationship between not just, I would stipulate, you don't have to agree, that Elon Musk is a totalitarian, I can't say it on the air, but he's an undesirable person with quasi-fascist tendencies. So, but there are people in history who got into this dystopian, racist, manipulative arena of eugenics, now predatory data, for arguably idealistic reasons. We mentioned H.G. Wells, who had an idealistic vision of the future. One of the great foremothers of of contraception. I don't want to say Margaret Sanger if I'm wrong, but one of them was a eugenicist, despite being clearly idealistic. Locksley Hall by Alfred Lord Tennyson, right? Where the famous phrase from there, ringing down the grooves of change, very visionary in many ways, very revolutionary in many ways. Then you get to a point where he talks about, I shall mate with a dusky woman from the dark races. And it's like, oh my God, this stuff is
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
But all of it to me, much more than, let's say, the Elon Musks and Peter Thiel, who are a different variety of predator, all this speaks to me of how a certain form of perhaps even naive idealism can
Yes.
lead an Oliver Wendell Holmes, or forgive me for saying this, I know some of my audience will get mad, but some of the centrist Democrats who have talked about an opportunity society. Wait a
Yep.
minute, that's the Hunger Games. That's not
Yep.
equality, right? You have an opportunity to survive in this precarious economy. I don't think so.
I
But
agree.
right? So that's another version, I think, of this predatory data-driven thing, right? If you're any good, you'll prove it by getting into an Ivy League school. Isn't that part of the same sort of perhaps well-intentioned in some ways, but still very biased manipulation of data?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are lighter ways of seeing a kind of, let's just say, veracity and the kind of that there could be a moral impulse to sort of quantifying human life and just sort of making calculations around who's more worthy than others. So certainly the kind of notion that again you were mentioning this sort of long spectrum of who was involved in the movement, and there's no question that a range of different eugenicists very much saw themselves as working for the betterment of society. And that there's no question that some of these tech moguls, including ones who are perhaps a little bit more innocent looking, let's say, a little more palatable at the face, like a Sam Altman, who seems more palatable, much more sort of, let's just say, friendly to interviews with Oprah Winfrey, that sort of thing. And back in their day, we shouldn't forget that, eugenicists, even the sort of most reviled versions, were really quite palatable, and again, saw themselves as being working in the interest of saving society. And, figures like Madison Grant was also a kind of celebrated environmentalist. He happened to also
Right.
write the book, The Passing of the Great Race, and talked about essentially the sort of blood of the nation as being ruined by immigration patterns, that the nation would become darker, and its intelligence would be increasingly diluted towards the darker races, and was projecting this very much as sort of the future of the nation, unless something around like immigration quotas were erected. He was very much part of. There's the famous story is that data and maps from the passing of the Great Race were leveraged by some of the founders of the Eugenic Research Organization, the ERO, Henry Lawlin and Charles Davenport, supersized and put into the hallways of Congress as decision making around the 1917 and 1924 immigration acts were being put forth. And essentially, through these sort of large scale data visualizations, we're really able to sort of channel the anxiety of the elites. That again, the nation would become slowly darker and more impure in terms of stature and physique and look, and that the blood of the nation would essentially be ruined unless we were to privilege what was framed as the Nordic races
Which
from
is back with a vengeance.
oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
when you hear Elon Musk repeating replacement theory, I mean, we can think, this is not, this is straight out of a eugenics playbook that's over 100 years old. So
Elon Musk, who grew up under, his father made his money in an apartheid economy and society, right? So,
exactly, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So, but when you ask about, so this question of palatability, where this was, I mean, I kind of give the snapshot again of just how um, not quite mainstream, but moving towards that. This was again thought of as the vanguard. Again, much like we think about datification today. I wouldn't argue that everyone has an appetite for AI or datification. The hope, I think their fantasy, the fantasy of techno elites is that we will become inured to this and that this will set a new norm for everybody such that we can just sort of accept it or roll over when we see some of its more pernicious impacts because we can already sort of see them around us. But that too was a dreamscape when over 100 years ago, I mean, now it's about 100 years ago, we saw literally the top American universities were all teaching US eugenics. Well, a version of eugenics was already in literally hundreds of American classrooms. Charles Davenport, again, the founder of the ERO, had published a textbook essentially to make sure that was taught across these classrooms to make sure that the best and the sons and daughters of the elites would essentially be taught eugenic practice in order to sort of save or also practice the kind of best future and secure the best future of the nation. This is our way of basically being able to do that and also to practice themselves as a well-informed, a new kind of information class that could manage their own sort of genetic futures and profiles, and were well-informed enough to also sort of help to manage the futures of others by deciding who was segregated from who and who potentially should be cut off from the potential to continue gene pools and gene lines. The Passing of the Great Race went through 15 different publications. It was a bestseller.
Right.
Historians call this the golden age of eugenics publishing because it really set off a firestorm amongst other publishers, not just Scribners, I mean, mainstream publishing houses, that they would start to look for eugenic titles and authors because they could see an appetite for this kind of disinformation, not unlike what we are seeing today in terms of sort of a monetization of disinformation, because it not just helps to it's not just profitable for platform owners, but as we've seen for several platform owners, it plays into exactly the kind of political future that they would want in terms of being able to, again, to sort of rejigger societies towards the most profitable, to start to sort of devolve and to cut off different expenses and protections for the more unfit and undeserving parts of the population.
Right.
Why support public education when we're really just essentially enabling the future and helping to support futures that were really just endangering the rest of the positive gene pool? Elon Musk's own kind of obsession with pro-natalist, this notion of like saving civilization, and him being on the record of talking to fellow Silicon Valleyites saying that we need to do a better job of making sure that we have more babies. He's not talking to average Americans
Right.
and the rest of the world, the average population across the rest of the world, saying everyone else around the world needs to have more babies in order to save civilization.
No,
He's
he's talking about himself, and
exactly,
and by having 8 children or whatever he's had,
exactly,
he thinks that's part of a greater eugenics war, right?
exactly, exactly right.
And and this
Yeah,
stuff is invented, isn't it? I mean, I think of Theodore Allen, the historian who wrote The Invention of the White Race. 400 years ago, a white English person wouldn't have known what it, they might say, well, yes, my skin is pale, right? But they wouldn't think I'm a white person. As he wrote, they'd think I'm a Christian or, maybe something else, but Englishman or a woman. But this has been created as well, sometimes unconsciously, I guess, sometimes consciously, right? But created as a form of social control.
yes, that's
And
right, right.
and to me, the two parties. Can we get into a little party political analysis here? Because are you okay with that? Because okay, for the record, the guest has nodded. The uh, to me, right now, the Republicans represent the sort of ugly, aggressive, bullying side of this, and the spewing of hatred about immigrants, and they're eating your pets and all that
Yep.
stuff. But to me, the flaw with the Democrats, and I would argue one of the reasons why they lost this year, is because the party does, in fact, radiate a kind of eliminationist, and you have a chapter on meritocracy
Yep,
and elites in your
yeah,
book.
exactly. Yep.
The party does seem to represent that sort of um, ivory covered version of it that says, well, if you're smart, there's nothing stopping you
Yeah.
doing what you want to do. Well, first of all, who defines smart? I remember somebody saying to me with great indignation, a fairly distant relative, that her brother had quit Harvard and gone off to make banjos in the Appalachians. And I thought, that's great. That sounds great to me. But, that was, betrayal of the tribe in a way. You understand, you get what I'm saying, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think this gets back to your question around the sort of another side of this kind of palatability of techno. I mean, what I think of as techno eugenics now, and or frame in the book as techno eugenics, and again, sort of connects back to also the sort of palatability in its day of eugenicists. But just to take some, figure. We mentioned some versions of Silicon Valley right now who are very, very clearly aligning themselves with sort of MAGA or far right and various nationalist agendas, are kind of like very openly spewing not just sort of like old versions, like literally reviving eugenic conspiracy theories, exactly the same language, but who are sort of taking on their own kinds of selective anti-immigrant stances. But there are more palatable versions too of Silicon Valley and of sort of knowledge classes within political elites, I think, as you're describing too, Richard. And I think that that's crucial to also this sort of formulation of why it is that it's not just sort of like one part of the spectrum that we need to sort of be critical about, that there is a whole
Right.
range of things. I mean, so, this kind of two things that I will point to, I mean, as sort of, again, to highlight the sort of lessons from eugenics is one, a kind of comfort with social experimentation and social experimentation at scale.
Hmm.
This is essentially, I mean, a version of social engineering and a kind of uh, um, sort of mindset, a kind of privilege, really, to be able to do this at scale without appropriate checks and balances. You
Right.
essentially wrote off, gave Silicon Valley, literally from decades ago, just a kind of blank check to build out essentially the largest infrastructure for real-time human experimentation that we have seen. And we have seen already some of the sort of outcomes of that in terms of degradation of different sorts of work sectors, I mean, journalism. Some would argue, different kinds of public infrastructures around jobs, working factories and the working class have seen a kind of degradation and insecurities in terms of their
Sure.
jobs, and in terms of labor sectors play out across the decades as essentially this kind of accelerationist and like economy of efficiency, and a shift towards knowledge economy has been happening and essentially has been held up as I mean, I write about it as well in the books, as sort of like this embrace of knowledge economy mantraism as if it were innocent, right? I mean, it made us
Right.
all focus on this sort of supposed ideal of the new knowledge class is going to be folks who can work on computers and know how to sort of think through intellectual property, think of their sort of output as framed as intellectual output, and think of things, in the sort of range of sort of digital goods and digital economy. And it sort of ended up um, by this kind of framing of the ideal of the knowledge classes, really sort of, I mean, throwing, working classes and laboring classes and everyone else that was sort of then by default framed as sort of backwards, and not part of this sort of future class of what the new economy was supposed to yield, because it was now going to be this economy based on creativity and endless productivity, and also everyone would get to live out their best intellectual selves because now the economy would be based and flowing around the version of knowledge practice and production. as opposed to this sort of like old world, inefficient, kind of manual labor. All of that was supposed to be retrograde. I mean, we embraced, I mean, so much public discourse, I feel like from the 1990s, I write about in the book, from the 1990s onward into the early 2000s, was sort of celebrated and
Right.
innocently framed, that this was, of course, the ideal that we can move towards, even amongst democratic circles. Again, with the sort of underplaying of the
Absolutely.
kind of violence and destabilization that this kind of disruption economy was leading to. Disruption was now sort of framed as good. And we saw this on the front pages of not just, Wired magazine, which was really a kind of Bible for this
Right.
kind of thinking.
Right.
Um, and in tech publications, but also, in the front pages of the New York Times and liberal publications, in the business sector, really kind of again idealizing this sort of new streamlined version of sort of better living and higher living that can now be determined by this kind of information elite or sort of digital elite that we should all sort of want to model ourselves under or as, without again thinking about really the kind of deprivation of pluralist thinking and a pluralist society, really excavating and not thinking about the kinds of existing forms of creativity. Well, I'll say too, prefacing by first saying, not taking seriously the kind of real damage and violence that this kind of
Hmm.
rapid move towards. I mean, new funding streams are all pushing towards this kind of new programs. I mean, education at universities has been radically shifted toward not just sort of kind of how to recreate students for this new sort of digital economy, but now very explicitly towards data science jobs and AI-based economies. I mean, you can see this happening literally. I mean, at every American university. I mean, from even down to community colleges and not R1 institutions. You can see how this logic is now remaking how education gets sort of filtered out. Um,
And
so,
in the meantime, if I may, at the
yeah,
same time that all this sort of deification and reification of, this abstract ideal, this ideology was taking place, as you describe, uh, inequality was soaring.
exactly.
So you
That's
had this sort of magical thinking to distract people. I remember through a mutual friend, I won't name him, but I was a mutual friend suggested I contact the then editor and publisher of Wired, who you mentioned, gave me his private email. I emailed him and said, this is what I work on. What do you suggest? Anything you interested? And he wrote me back and he said, astound us. And I thought, yeah, that's the culture. Some of the things that need to be said in this world, Anita, aren't astounding.
yeah,
They're
right.
just, they're just real. But this I'll be a star, this individualistic, hyper
Right.
competitive, they all stand for that. And so,
Absolutely.
uh,
Absolutely.
you know,
It deprives two things. It sets up this sort of game as if this version of astound us, revolutionize something, that's
right.
the only way that any sort of version of value or good or even creativity can be recognized. And of course, it also sets them up as the sort of arbiter of what that looks like. Again, this sort of like conceit that their version of that kind of goodness should be the version. That sort of right, that they would, of course, be adequate arbiters of what is astounding, what is really genuinely creative, and what looks revolutionary. When again, I mean, the other part of the coin is not just that it's not, as I was saying, this shift in this deification, this reification, this kind of hyper idealization of this kind of mode of thinking and this shift towards knowledge economy was all doing, not just sort of depriving and ignoring the kind of violence it was doing to working classes, but also depriving them of any kind of investment through recognizing actually other forms of creativity and
Yes.
resilience, solution making, even around technology that was happening. That just didn't look um, shiny or blinging enough or astounding enough, according to, again, this sort of very narrow arbiter and judgment coming from a kind of knowledge elite that was, in control of lots of different purse strings and able to sort of, again, decide who gets funding for what. How does the sort of like who gets to shift the knowledge elite towards what kinds of programs. And so partly I was also writing the book to also underscore that this is not just a kind of, again, sort of violence to the working classes, but also a kind of deprivation of them to get the kind of attention for the various kinds of community-based solutions that we still see happening and bubbling up, but they just aren't resourced the way that we are enabling the kinds of resourcing to Silicon Valley corporations and big tech firms. I mean, if universities were instead much more dedicated to thinking through how might we be connective for our students, to pipelining them through the various kinds of civic infrastructures, amplifying the kind of creative and generative power, even the uses of data and the kinds of questions that different sorts of civic organizations, local organizations are thinking through, we would see a very, very different kind of social program in place and a different kind of civic generativity in place, if that version of sort of local responsiveness and civic responsiveness were what our knowledge infrastructures were primarily concerned with, as opposed to feeding them into sort of the kinds of given obvious sort of money making places, which I will tell you just from speaking to students is not where their heart's desire is bent around. Many
Right.
students are not interested in going and just feeding this beast. It is soul sucking and really yeah, I mean, just collapses their imagination. Many of them will do it because they've got loans to pay off.
Right.
But so
Right.
hungry.
And we haven't even gotten into the work they make us do when we get home by addicting us to social media. But there's so much. There's so much we haven't gotten into, but whether it's in terms of what you call the quote race suicide or feminist refusals, feminist resistance, community data, which I know you work on, and some of the other responses. So I'm sorry that we're running out of time, but I hope we get to talk again, and I strongly encourage people to find your book. Again, the book is Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. And my guest is Anita Say Chan, the author of that book and a professor and so much more. So that's it. Thanks so much for your great work in writing this book, Anita, and thank you for coming on this program.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Me too. We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.